Jumping off from what we just heard from Senator Whitehouse, if you're investigating both the former president's interactions with the DOJ and then what happened in Georgia, where do you even begin? How do you tie the two together, and what legal outcomes are on the table?
That seems to me to be exactly the right question to answer, because the temptation is to look at these events as isolated from each other. But what we really have is one long spectrum of a course of conduct. The question, of course, is ultimately whether or not that's criminal and whether DOJ will file some form of an indictment against Trump or others. So far, we haven't heard a lot from DOJ. Typically, folks think that there's not appetite to be perceived as political at DOJ, but they simply haven't spoken in this regard. And so for now, we have what's going on in Congress, which is this tremendous fact-finding exercise, bringing the truth to the forefront and letting the American people know what happened with the former president, starting well before the election, moving into the election itself, where, Alex, you'll recall, he declined to say that he believed that the election would be fair even before it was conducted. And then we had the entire big lie, which ultimately led to January 6th, when an increasingly desperate former president realized that he was not going to be able to keep Joe Biden's election from being certified. And we ended up with the violence on January 6th. So exposing that entire course of conduct is in and of itself justice in a way. The question that remains is whether prosecutors in Georgia or in the federal system will find crimes that need to be prosecuted.
Okay, but you know what? The Department of Justice is all about the law, right? So this may sound like a naive question, but why does the level of politics play into whether or not a law is a law that has been broken at all?
So again, I think that's just the right question to ask. DOJ is supposed to look at the facts and the law and make prosecutive decisions solely on that basis. And federal prosecutors across the country do that every day in public corruption cases that involve mayors or senators or governors. It's not like they've never done this before. There is a real hesitancy in the federal system to engage in prosecutions that are perceived as purely political. But in a situation like this, where you have a former president and people around him who engaged in what can only be described as a slow-moving coup, then prosecution has to be on the table. That's not to say that the government would have everything it would need to indict. And there are important questions involving the exercise of the First Amendment and whether that would act as a barrier to prosecution. But at the end of the day, DOJ prosecutors in Georgia will simply have to look at the law and the facts and make a decision about whether prosecution is merited on these facts without regard to who any of the defendants are and what sort of political power they may have exercised at some point.
So as you look at the Capitol riot, Donald Trump wanted to assert executive privilege over certain documents requested by the House January 6th committee and was blocked doing so by the Biden administration. What do you make of his request? I mean, did it hold any water at all? Does he have grounds to try again to keep these documents from being released?
It's unsurprising that he would make the request. Trump is no stranger to specious legal arguments, but he's no longer the president of the United States, and it's up to the current president to decide whether or not there's executive privilege. And Joe Biden has already said no, there's not. For purposes of January 6 investigations, the subject is of such tremendous importance that he will not exert executive privilege. Trump, I suppose, can go to court and try to claim that he still has some rights, but you can understand how ridiculous that is. Even if, for instance, people like Steve Bannon, who wasn't working in the White House, could theoretically be covered by executive privilege, which Bannon can't be, the notion that every former living president could exert executive privilege is simply unworkable. Biden holds the privilege. Biden says materials can be turned over, and ultimately a court will order that. The question is how successful Trump will be at playing the delay game that he plays so frequently with the courts.
Right. Okay. Joyce Vance, thank you so much. Good to talk with you. Familiar symptoms in a different location. What we know about new cases of Havana syndrome at the